Chapter 11. Cleansing Angelica. It was too windy to sit under the ramada in the dusk, and too spooky to wait inside Don Juan's house. So I decided to sit in the car until Carlos or Don Juan returned. I was absorbed in writing up my notes when I heard a knocking on the windshield. I nearly jumped through the car roof. Don Juan was staring through the glass, motioning me to roll down the window. "Let's go for a walk," he said when I got out of the car. He was carrying a bundle tied to his back like a knapsack. "But won't it be dark soon?" I said. "So much the better," he replied. Obediently, I put on my poncho and sombrero and followed him into the chaparral. According to my compass, which I always carried with me, we were heading in a westerly direction. As I trudged behind him, I noticed his hands. The tips of his middle and ring fingers were curled and pressed against the palms, while the thumbs, index, and pinky fingers were extended in a natural position. "Keep your fingers like this and you won't tire yourself," he said, holding up his hand for me to see. "And positioning your gaze just above the horizon helps to quiet your thoughts. If you succeed, you will have more energy while walking." "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to copy his hand position. "To a place of power," he said, picking up his pace. Even though I kept my gaze just above the horizon as Don Juan had recommended, I could not quiet my thoughts. I was lining up in my mind all the questions I had been unable to ask him earlier. Now they were bursting to get out. Was it really the power of the mask and dance movements that caused me to have that vision of the deer? I blurted out. "The rattling of the cocoons was the line that took you into the dream world, and the link that brought you back," Don Juan said. "But the dancer himself can move someone with his intent." "What do you mean by intent?" I asked. "I mean that the energy coming out of the dancer can impinge on the energy of the observer and can change the world around him. You, being liquid, were easily moved." "But is there really another world one can enter? Do you believe the Yaqui myth of the realm of the Monte populated by invisible people? And what about the spirit animals? Do they exist?" He stopped to peer at me for an instant. "After what you've seen, how can you ask those questions?" "I just want your opinion," I said defensively. "The Yaqui Indians call it the realm of the Monte, but I call it the world of dreaming," he said. "Women are better at slipping into this realm than men, because they are less rigid in their expectations and beliefs. Now, no more questions. Let's walk in silence." The distant hills were already bathed in shades of dark purple, and the sky was what my art teachers had always called a perfect watercolor sky, with billowing clouds in different shades of gray, red, and pink. We came towards a clump of green shrubbery and a long row of cottonwood trees. When we were closer, I could see that the upper branches of the trees had been cut off, as if they had been harvested, or someone had done a poor job of pruning. Still, it was one of the few areas in the terrain where there was lush vegetation. "That's the Yaqui River," Don Juan said, pointing to the clump of trees. "It cuts across the territory, bringing the only source of water to the land. That's why places along it are power spots. Plants and animals flock to them, as well as spirits that seek moisture." We crossed over a low plank bridge that seemed about to fall apart under our feet. "It's not very big," I remarked, looking down. and it's practically dry. Somehow I expected a real river full of water. After the rains, it fills up, he assured me. But it is never very wide. We climbed down the barranca to a creek on the other side. It was one of the areas where the earth was moist. Don Juan told me to be careful because the rocks were slippery. After walking down the creek for a stretch, we sat on a rock. Don Juan took off his knapsack, reached in and handed me a round Mexican bread and an orange, and some thin strips of dried meat. I was famished, for I hadn't eaten since lunch. We missed the food at the Holy Trinity Festival, because as visitors, it would not be safe for us to eat from the street vendors. I began to peel the orange and wiped my fingers on some dry leaves. From where we sat, I could hear the trucks rumbling by on the highway, stirring up clouds of dust and exhaust. Trucks in Mexico have names given to them by their owners, which they paint above the bumper, Don Juan explained. The one that just passed was called Wounded Heart. I wondered how he knew that, for there was no way he could have seen the truck from where we were sitting. I see, he said casually. What does it mean to see, Don Juan? It means different things to different people. Sometimes it's having the certainty that a thing is so. Other times, it's a voice that tells you something specific. Or it can be a visual sensation of seeing energy fibers or colors moving around a person, plant, animal, or object. It can even be a longing that grips you and doesn't let go. I have a longing that doesn't let me go, I said, but I don't know what it is. I can never voice it. It comes from so far away. Don Juan looked at me for a moment, then shook his head. That's not seeing. That's called indulging. He let out a spurt of genuine laughter. I wanted to argue with him, but he shook his head. I bet it has something to do with finding love, he said, giving me a nudge. I suppose you're right, I conceded. But don't sorcerers love or want to be loved? They do, but not in the way ordinary people fall in and out of love. A sorcerer's affection is peerless. He has no vested interest or personal attachment to his feeling. It is given without any strings attached, and once given, it is never ever retracted. The finality of his statements gave me a chill. It made any notion of love that I had ever come across seem paltry, inferior, and soaked in emotional indulging. I don't know if I could commit myself in such a final, absolute way, I said, offering him half of the bread. Don Juan laughed and said that it had nothing to do with personal choice or commitment. It was rather a question of fate, to which one either acquiesced and acted impeccably, or resisted to one's dying breath. The flow of fate bringing people together is rare and mysterious, he said softly. Only a blind fool or knowledge criminal would not acquiesce to such a gift. What is a knowledge criminal? His eyes were glossy, as if remembering something that happened long ago. Someone who knows better but obstinately refuses to act upon his knowledge. Then he laughed and said teasingly, "Don't worry, this is not a proposition from an old man." I laughed too, but a bit more nervously than I had intended. Don Juan was far from being an old man. Another truck drove by. I wondered where it was going. Perhaps to Mazatlan or Guadalajara, or even as far south as Mexico City. I commented to Don Juan that I had never been to any of these places. "You'll go there soon," he said with such certainty that I was forced to ask, "How do you know? Are you seeing again?" "Carlos will take you there," he said. "Zuleika is in Guadalajara, waiting for you. She has something to teach you." "Can't I stay here with you?" I asked, feeling at ease in his company and afraid to death of what Zuleika had to teach me. "No, your path is different. We are all bound to help you, but you are not like us. You have to return to Los Angeles. You have other things to do." "What will I have to do?" I asked, alarmed. "That is for the Spirit to decide. It will tell you, and your power will dictate what you are capable of." He nudged me and said softly, "You are capable of more than you realize." Just then, a gust of wind rustled the leaves of the cottonwood trees. I felt a chill that entered my very bones. The consequence of not being up to the Spirit's challenge was too devastating to formulate. So even thought I didn't know what that challenge might be. I decided to seize it. "Tell me more about the Dear Dancer, Don Juan. Exactly how does the dancer enter into another realm?" Don Juan took off his hat and wiped his forehead with a handkerchief he had in his shirt pocket. "At first, entering the dream world may be a frightening experience, or it may only seem like a dream from which one doesn't wake up. But for a sorcerer, that dream is real, and if you go into that world often enough, it will become real for you too." "How can a sorcerer or Yaqui say the dream world is real?" I asked. "Can't they tell the difference between the waking state and dreams?" "For sorcerers, it's real because they can act in the dream state with certainty and control. They stalk their dreams. They can learn things, find things, understand things that are not clear in the everyday world." "What kind of things?" "Things about the future or what someone is doing miles away. It's a way of seeing beyond what is in front of you." "Are you talking about divination, Don Juan?" The anthropological literature was full of references of how, in primitive cultures, the shaman enters a trance to see what the future holds, to diagnose illness, or to seek out the proper treatment. African witch doctors were particularly fond of using smoke and charred bones or the livers of chickens to make forecasts. Magic, sorcery, divination, witchcraft, all these areas were a part of the anthropological tradition. Yet they always had seemed so far removed from our actual day-to-day activities or personal lives. To the Yaqui, such activities did not seem strange at all. Don Juan himself had used his dancing to open the door to the world of spirits, to a different reality. A world that was for a sorcerer as real and predictable as the everyday world was for us. "The magical realm of the Yaqui isn't extraordinary at all," Don Juan said. "It's not a part of the supernatural or an aspect of the sacred and profane dichotomy anthropologists so readily set up. How do you know about what anthropologists do? I asked. Arizona is full of anthropologists, he laughed, especially the tribal areas around Tucson. Someone is always trying to get a poor sucker to answer a questionnaire for a few dollars. They go around making categorization schemes without ever knowing what they are talking about. My sentiments exactly, I said. But I tried telling that to one of my professors once he accused me of not being professional material and proceeded to kick me out of his office. You have to learn to stalk your professors, Don Juan recommended, or they'll gobble you up for breakfast. Those professors feast on young co-eds. How do I stalk them? I asked. Treat the university as a hunting ground. If you go there to be discovered, or to be liked, or to make a statement, you'll fall flat on your face. If they sense you are challenging them, the petty tyrants will put up a fight, and they almost always win. How can I overcome them? I asked. They are men, they are petty, and they hold the power. You walk around them on cat feet and never let them know your opinions or what you are thinking. A consummate stalker has no opinions. He or she adapts to any circumstance, swiftly and smoothly, like wind. If they think they have you cornered, you are already somewhere else. Be elusive and beyond containment, but devastatingly powerful. That sounds like a contradiction to me, I said. Just then, another gust of wind ruffled the ground leaves. It blew a bunch right into my lap. Don Juan laughed and said I was going to make a superb stalker, provided that I treated everything as controlled folly and make myself zero so no one would be able to grab hold of me. Besides, only someone who is as light as the wind can pass through the cracks between the worlds, Don Juan continued. What do you mean by the cracks between the worlds? I asked. The sorcerers see that the world of the spirits exists and that there are entities other than human beings and animals that roam the earth, Don Juan said. But they exist behind a wall that is full of cracks, so to speak. A sorcerer takes that knowledge for granted, just as Westerners take for granted the belief in God, heaven, the scientific method, or the Pope's infallibility, or walking on the moon, or anything else that affects their everyday lives. Are you saying that Neil Armstrong never walked on the moon? Or that he passed through some sort of cosmic crack to get there? Not at all. Only that it takes a tremendous effort for man to bring into his awareness the end result, that of a man walking in outer space. Or that a man in Rome is the direct representative of God on earth. Or that a virgin conceived a son. In the light of these feats of intending, the knowledge that other entities coexist with man on earth does not take such a great leap of faith. I looked around. I had never regarded spirits as part of my daily world. But as a child, I did see shadows coming alive and had at times felt the presence of a guardian angel. I had also assumed saints, fairies, elves, and leprechauns existed, even though I had never seen one. So it was not so difficult to accept that the Yaqui Indians, too, had spirit entities, like the spirit deer I had encountered, who protect and advise them, as do our supernatural helpers. If the Yaqui say there is a spirit world and that they learn in dreams, a person would have to experience this kind of learning to know what they are talking about, I told Don Juan. If the Yaqui address themselves to a mythological realm and treat it as reality, in order to understand it, the anthropologist must do the same. He must make their myths his reality. I told Don Juan that it is the anthropologist's task to describe to the best of his ability what goes on in another culture, in another reality, the way members of that culture see and live it. Therefore, he has to be as open and accessible to phenomena that he encounters, no matter how strange that might be, no matter how different from his own expectations or experiences. In short, the field worker must suspend judgment while he is doing research. Only in this way might he go beyond his limited way of thinking, his ethnocentrism, and his perceptual bias. Furthermore, by seeing another reality, one's own taken for granted reality would lose its ultimate importance. Women make the best sorcerers, Don Juan said after listening to my discourse. And no doubt the best anthropologists too. Why is that? Because they are much more sensitive than men. They can experience and accept things beyond their range more readily, without the insistence on reasserting themselves the way men do. On the other hand, women are much more vulnerable and must be cushioned from the shock of encountering other realities. They tend to indulge and lose their underpinnings at the drop of a hat. I laughed, because for a moment I thought he had said women lose their underpants at a drop of the hat. That too, Don Juan said, laughing. But unfortunately, there is never a shortage of men to support them in that department. In a more serious note, he added that if a woman was sober, courageous, and adventuresome, and didn't lose her underpants, she could uncover mysteries beyond her wildest expectations. But doesn't she have to have spirit helpers? I asked. It's true. Some spirits are helpers, Don Juan continued. Every person, upon birth, receives a totem animal that protects and advises him throughout his lifetime. Perhaps yours is the deer. I liked deer. I was born in an area full of forests and plenty of deer. I enjoyed being in the forest, being still, remaining hidden. I had to agree, I had something in common with deer by way of temperament. What is your totem animal? I asked. The crow. I have always had an affinity with them, ever since my teacher showed me how to become one. I like birds too, I said. I often dream I'm flying. Crows are excellent stalkers, Don Juan added, and some of the Pascola masks depict them. I finished the orange and the rest of the dried meat. The dancer, if he has power, can actually turn into the animal he portrays, Don Juan continued. I've talked to and observed quite a number of Pascola dancers. For some, the dance is merely a means to show off, but for others, the dance is a vehicle. The mask, the music, and the mesmeric movement of the cocoon rattles usher the dancer into the spirit realm. There he can learn about the mysteries of the universe and even find answers to life's fundamental questions. Don Juan gave me a nudge, and I knew he was referring to what I had asked the spirit deer. Or perhaps Carlos had told him about our meeting in the anthropology department when I had asked him the same question. If you meet the deer in your dreams, he advised me, ask him about the meaning of life. He will tell you what you want to know. Is that what you do, Don Juan? Learn in your dreams? Don Juan nodded. And through seeing. Right now, I see that there is a patch of angelica growing over there. Exactly the plant we came all this way to find. We got up and walked toward the bend in the creek where Don Juan had said the plants were growing. What are the plants for? I asked. They are invaluable for female sorcerers, he said. It gives them sobriety, purpose, and cushions them from the erratic perceptual changes that they are prone to, especially during their menstrual periods. Earlier as we walked, he had stopped from time to time to allow me to examine certain plants at close range. He had cushioned me not to pick any of them, but only to remember what they looked like in case I ever needed to find them. There was manzanilla, sage, and a small plant with blue flowers. He had said that we were not there to gather herbs, but to learn how to store power. He assured me that if I ever needed to heal myself, it would be through manipulating energy directly, not by ingesting any plant. There was one exception to this rule, and that was the angelica plant. We walked up to some large yellow-green plants that looked like tall, overgrown celery. They had shot up about a yard, and at the tips were tufts of dried stalks with tiny brown seeds. This is angelica, he said, taking off a bit of the leaf and rubbing it between his fingers. It smells like celery, I said, taking a sniff. What does it taste like? Find out for yourself, he said, and gave me a bit of the seeds to chew. It tasted like bitter celery. Do I make an infusion out of the leaves or seeds? I asked. You can, or you chew on the seeds directly. But in your case, it's better to smoke it. How do I smoke it? You first dry the stalks and then crush a bit and put it in a pipe and light a match to it. I've never smoked anything in my life, I said. Not even marijuana? He teased. A friend of mine gave me a joint once to try, but I didn't like it. The smoke really hurt my lungs and made me sneeze. You see, I'm allergic to smoke. This is not marijuana, he said seriously. Besides, you probably inhaled too much smoke into your lungs when you should have allowed the smoke to envelop you. What does angelica smoke do? I asked. It cleans the energy fibers of the body. He stepped back and gave me a groggy look, running his eyes up and down from head to toe. There's a great deal of debris clinging to your fibers, in spite of your recapitulation, he said. So, in stubborn cases like yourself, one has to use smoke to cleanse the double. You don't have to inhale it. Just allow the smoke to caress you. It knows what to do. It will clean you without you having to direct it. Don Juan gathered some of the dry stalks and put them inside his knapsack. He said he would give them to me later. If I ran out, I would have to find the next batch myself. What if I can't come back here? I said. Angelica grows everywhere, he replied. You can find it in abundance in the canyons around Los Angeles. Then you have to let the stalks dry and find a pipe in your dreaming and put some crushed leaves inside. Or you can light the tip of the stalk directly. We sat down on a log and he asked me for a match. I pulled out a matchbook from my pocket along with the compass. I always carry a book of matches in my pockets so that I could gaze at its flame whenever I needed to. I wondered how Don Juan knew I had matches with me. He lit a dry stalk about 3 inches long by holding a match to its tip. Then he moved the stalk back and forth in front of my nose and allowed the smoke to envelop me. The smoke made me cough and my eyes burn, and I didn't like the sensation at all. But when the smoke cleared, I experienced a calmness and clarity that was unprecedented. At first, I couldn't pinpoint exactly what the difference was. Then I realized that my calmness resulted from the fact that my internal dialogue had completely stopped. I had no more thoughts. I was content to perceive directly, without filtering everything through words and thoughts. I felt that the I that was always in command had vanished. Somehow the smoke had made things absolutely still, so that there was no separation between the analytical I and the things that it thought about. Subtle as it was, it seemed like the difference between night and day. During the day, everything is agitated. The streets are full of traffic and noise, the energy of people, and the tension and hurry of life fills one's being. At night, things quiet down. No one is going anywhere. The birds, too, have settled in their nests, and all is at rest. That was the way I felt after I had inhaled only a few puffs of smoke. Completely at rest, with no hurry, no worries. Everything had returned to its natural place. The world was the way it should be, without the constant interference of thoughts and expectations. It was an exquisite feeling of serenity that the smoke brought. It was like burning incense in a church. I began to breathe deeply from my abdomen and relish the tranquility and ease of having nothing to say, nothing to do, and no place to go, except to be where I was at that precise moment in time. It was as if my being had blended with eternity, extending in front of my eyes. The angelic smoke is like that, Don Juan said, sensing my mood. It expects nothing from you. It humbly does its job of cleansing away the debris of the past. If you are emotionally upset or agitated, surround yourself with angelica smoke. No need to inhale it, and only use it when you feel agitated and need to calm yourself. Never abuse it. Together with the recapitulation, it will serve as a means to cleanse and soothe the erratic bent of your nature. Don Juan reiterated that I didn't need to use a pipe or to really inhale at all. I could just light a bit of the stalk and let the smoke rise while holding the piece of angelica root in my left hand. The effect would be the same. The smell of the smoke around me would be enough to clear my head and cause my internal dialogue to cease. He had a small fire. He made a small fire out of wood, then placed some branches of angelica that he had collected from the ground on top of the tier. We sat in front of it for a while, and from time to time he used his jacket to fan the smoke in my direction. When the fire had extinguished itself, he took a stick and pointed to the charred remains. Earlier, you wanted to know about seeing, he said. The ancient sorcerers of our lineage used many different methods to understand the state of things. They used corn kernels, the patterns in the clouds, the formation of leaves in the trees and on the ground, or, after a fire had gone out, the placement of the charred wood. Chapter 12. Crow's Dream. It was past midnight by the time we returned to Don Juan's house. Carlos's car was still parked where he had left it, so I knew he had not returned. I wanted to sleep in the car with the windows rolled up and the doors locked, but Don Juan would not hear of it. My house is at your disposal, he said with an air of gallantry. Please, make yourself at home. He assured me that I would be perfectly safe, and he personally guaranteed that his house had no fleas because he kept no animals. He lit a kerosene lantern and set it on the table that was next to a cot. He handed me a folded wool blanket and said he needed to go to Torum to see some people. He stressed that he would not be back until the following day. What if someone comes snooping around here? I said, ill at ease. No one will disturb you, he assured me. How can you be so certain? This house is well protected. By what? An invisible alarm system? I said with a laugh. You could call it that. I have a guardian that frightens off any unwanted visitors. At first I thought he was referring to a guard dog, but before I could ask him who this guardian was, he said, "Shall I show it to you?" No, I'll take your word for it, I said, suddenly afraid. If I was to sleep there, I didn't want any frightening details to play on my imagination. If you do see or hear something unusual, it's best just to ignore it, he said. I nodded and took the blanket. When he left the room, I lay down on the cot that had a lumpy horsehair mattress. I tried to fall asleep, but sleep would not come. A part of me was wide awake, on the alert. The other part was desperately trying to fall asleep. Instead of feeling the hardness of the mattress beneath me, I felt as if I were suspended in a soft cotton batting that was warm and numbing. I attributed this odd sensation to the strange vibrations in the room that made all hardness dissolve. It was a liquid room, moving, changing shapes in the darkness. Or perhaps it was my blood or adrenaline surging through my body, or being in the Nawal's lair. But the buzzing became louder until my body seemed to disappear, and all that was left of me was a dull, overall tingling. The feeling was reminiscent of the first night I had spent in Clara's treehouse. On that occasion, being off the ground had made my body expand, balloon outward, and I had been enveloped with the same sensation of floating, with no self-reference in terms of my physical size or shape. Emilito had later explained this sensation as my double coming out and taking over, because being in the treehouse had inhibited the pull of gravity on my physical body. I was remembering Emilito and the mysterious treehouse when I heard a snapping that sounded like a twig breaking, coming from a pile of baskets in the corner of the room. All my senses were on alert. The front of my body seemed totally open, as if there were a huge gaping hole where my stomach and chest should have been. I strained to see in the darkness, but could see only the outlines of the paraphernalia in the room. A few gourds hanging from ropes, 2 yaki masks, one of a deer, another of a crow hooked to the post. The silhouette, the kerosene lantern. The silhouette of the kerosene lantern on the table. I heard the noise again. The snapping might have been a giant cricket, except that the sound was too clipped, too brittle. It was more like the click of a metal dime store toy in the shape of a frog or a mouse that snaps when the metal lever is depressed and released. Now the click was on the other side of the room. It seemed to have moved closer to the cot. I raised up a bit, leaning against the folded burlap bag that served as a pillow. I jumped when I heard the sound next to my head. The click came again, this time by the door. It made the area in my midsection leap whenever it snapped. Whatever the sound was, it was definitely hopping about the room, as if trying to attract my attention. As I lay wide awake, trying to anticipate from where the next click would be coming, I realized that the sorcerer's world was full of the unexpected. I decided to follow Don Juan's advice and ignore whatever it was in the room. I must have fallen asleep, for I drifted into a dream that seemed totally real. I was taking the crow mask off the wall and put it on my head. Don Juan was going to show me some movements. First, he demonstrated how I should position my feet. Bending my knees, I had to raise up on the balls of my feet, then thump down onto the heels repeatedly. I copied his action, raising my heels off the ground, then sharply placing them down again. After a while, it became a single smooth performance involving my ankle and knee joints. I felt my legs become rubbery, viscous. My hands were hanging loosely at my sides. I imagined myself a winemaker trampling on a vat of grapes with my bare feet. Then, following Don Juan's lead, I arched the upper portion of my back as if I were lifted by some exterior force, and bringing my arms out to the sides of my body. I opened them up like the wings of an enormous bird. My head was inclined forward, and I was looking down. While raising my arms up and down in conjunction with my breathing, I flapped my arms again and again in a repetitive action. After what seemed an eternity, the ground in front of me opened, and I was no longer dreaming. I was standing, waving my arms in simulated flight. I was actually in the air, soaring over a breathtaking view of the desert. I could see vegetation, irrigation ditches, roads, and the pataya fences around the flat-roofed adobe houses. As I soared in the air, I moved my arms so vigorously that I was growing tired. I heard Don Juan say that I did not have to flap so hard, but that I could, if I wished, simply glide. At his suggestion, I let go and experienced the most exquisite sensation of gliding through the air. I could feel the wind ruffle my sleek black feathers, and in the distance, I could see the most beautiful snow-capped mountains. I suspected they were the sacred mountains of the mythical Yaqui world, but they were as real as any formation in the waking world. They were breathtaking in their splendor, more beautiful than any landscape I had ever seen on this earth. I flew over the valley, soaring, then flapping my wings, only to glide again. Then I heard music drifting toward me from the distance. As the music filled my very being, I experienced a state of exquisite happiness. I heard Don Juan say that I could land if I was tired. I looked down and saw a grove of tall trees and headed for the top branches. "You can stop moving your arms now," Don Juan said. "The crow has safely landed." I perched on the branch and rested. I could feel my crow's body, my beak and head, and my feathery wings. I was preening myself the way birds do, happy to be in the tree with the breeze rustling the leaves. When I had rested, I swooped down to a field and began hopping on the ground. After a while, another crow came and hopped alongside me. Then the strangest thing happened. The crow mounted me, and we mated, the way crows do. Not that I had the faintest notion of how crows mated, yet I was certain I was experiencing the act the way crows did it. In fact, the other crow, in no time at all, had me in the position he wanted, and a pleasurable interchange followed. The realization that the other crow was Don Juan made it all the more exhilarating. In that dream, I saw and felt things that for the rational mind are incomprehensible. And although my rational mind was circumvented, my senses were keen, and I experienced an outpouring of the most profound affection. It was that surge of emotion that created such a stirring in the depth of me that I would always remember the feeling of my crow's body and what it was like to soar through the air lighter than the wind. After a while, the field vanished, and I found myself again standing in Don Juan's house, flapping my arms in the stylized crow's flight. I felt something rough brushing my face, and I heard breathing that wasn't my own. I realized then that the blanket was rubbing my cheek and that it was I who was breathing heavily in my sleep. As the moment of dual awareness merged, I awoke and found myself lying on the cot. I remembered every detail of the dream, and I closed my eyes to recapture the feeling of the wind rushing against me and to bring back the glorious mountain range surrounding that rapturous valley. For a long time, I lay awake in the darkness, half listening for the clicking sounds to come again. But they had stopped. So had the loud buzzing that had permeated the room. Light was shining through the window as dawn was breaking. I leaned over my notepad and pen and wrote down everything I could remember about the crow's dream. The image of the terrain was crystal clear, and I could still hear the music of the mountains and feel its melodic stains softly vibrate inside my body. When I had finished writing down my recollections, I put my notebook aside and dozed off again. I awoke several hours later with the sun shining in my eyes. I could tell by the light it was going to be an extremely hot day. I sat up when I heard Don Juan coming in the door. "How were your accommodations?" he asked, opening a sack of groceries he had placed on the table. "Not too uncomfortable, I trust." "I had the most vivid dream of flying over the desert," I said. He asked me to describe the dream in detail, which I did, for it was still fresh in my mind. He looked at me and smiled, as if he knew I had deliberately left out the part about the two crows cavorting in the field. "To turn into a crow in your dreams is not so far-fetched," he said. "To do it while you are awake is another matter." "How can you turn into a crow while you are awake?" "With unbending intent. The body will follow where the mind leads," he assured me. I asked him to explain what he meant by that. "You do it all the time," he said. "For example, when you activate a memory called unhappiness, your whole being immerses itself in that feeling and you become unhappy. That is why indulging in anything is not recommended. The mind is not separate from the body, although we prefer to think that it is." I opened a bottle of mineral water and took a sip. "Every time we look in a mirror," Don Juan said, "or see our reflection in a pool of water, we think we see the same person we saw the last time we looked. We may see a few changes, such as wrinkles or a longer beard or a different expression, but we know these differences are superficial. They don't make us someone else. We have learned to recognize ourselves as being that change. Yet to our inner eye, we are nevertheless the same." He leaned toward me and brought his face uncomfortably close to mine. "But it's only a mirage," he whispered. "That's why you should never look too closely in a mirror. You'll fix yourself permanently as something you don't want to be." I suspected that Clara had told him of my repeated request to have mirrors installed in her bathhouse. I had a difficult time adjusting to not seeing my reflection and kept trying to catch glimpses of myself on any shiny, reflective surface. He reiterated that we are constantly changing and are never the same from moment to moment. Every new thought, action, or experience makes us different. It is only the memory of ourselves that assures us that we are continuous, stable, and familiar. "If we are always changing," I said, "how can we recognize ourselves?" He said that there is no way of ever recognizing ourselves, because we are a mystery, totally unknown to ourselves and to others. That is one of the precepts of stalking, he stressed. I learned it from my benefactor, the Nawal Julian, and I am passing it on to you. We are an indescribable mystery. But I know who I am, I insisted. That's because you're a fool, Don Juan said, chuckling. It's idiotic to believe that just because you have a name, an address, a job, or go to school, that you are known to yourself or to others. These attributes are not your true self. They are only ways of describing who you are, so that you can talk about yourself as a social person. Are you saying that I don't exist? You do exist, but not in the way you think, he said. Don Juan stressed that the idea that the body is a constant, continuous entity is one of the most difficult assumptions to break. Why is that? I asked, taking a bite of the bread that he brought. Because people identify themselves with their bodies, which they view in the manner that is accepted by the world around them. I argued that the physical body is real and not just an appearance. But he insisted that to hold this position stemmed from limited perception and faulty reasoning. Your body is an idea, an abstraction, he reiterated. How you regard it depends on your culture and the modality of the time in which you live. For example, people of the past did not have the same view of the body as we do today, and Western man does not have the same view of it as does a sorcerer. Don't we all have basically the same physical structure? I asked. 2 arms and legs and a torso? If we all had the same physical makeup, we would all be able to do the same things, he replied. But most people can't fly through the air, or step through walls, or extend their luminous fibers to journey over vast distances, or disappear right in front of your eyes. I must have given him a quizzical look, for he added, some people can't perceive their ethereal or energetic body that would allow them to perform these extraordinary feats. Therefore, unlike the sorcerer, who daily tunes and invigorates his energetic body, his double, the average person does nothing to enhance it, but does everything to enhance his self-importance, his social person. What do you mean by self-importance? I asked. Don Juan thought for a moment, as if to choose his words. It is placing undue emphasis on the idea a person has of himself. In order for that idea to become real, it must be given constant energy. One must always cater to it, sustain it, reinforce it, pamper it, in order to keep it alive. When I asked him why was that so, Don Juan replied that people have lost touch with their mysterious origins that render them unknown, and were left only with a paltry imitation, a phantom idea that they regard as real. If people realized that they were unknown to themselves and to others, they would not regard themselves as important or prop themselves up with feeling special. They would know that they already are special. But having lost sight of their real mystery, They try to make themselves mysterious and try to act important. But that is a deadly mistake. Why is that a mistake? Because we should never try to be anything, he replied. Our mysterious nature already makes us everything we could possibly be. Don Juan said he wanted to go for another walk and told me to finish eating so I could accompany him. What about Carlos? I asked. Shouldn't I wait here for him? Isn't he coming back today? Don Juan handed me a strip of beef jerky and told me to chew it slowly. I have a feeling that Carlos will be occupied for most of the day, he said. I was dying to know what exactly Carlos would be occupied with. No doubt it was that pretty girl I had seen the other day in the store. I imagined he would spend the day teaching her English, or who knows what else. Noticing my preoccupation, Don Juan gave me a firm rap on the top of my head with his knuckles. I know what you are thinking. Why would a man want another woman when he can have you? Your petty possessiveness is useless around here, he said gruffly. You have an idea of yourself that you are jealous and possessive. The sooner you get rid of that idea, the better off you will be. That's the way most women feel, I said. Then that's precisely what you will have to guard against, he said sternly. Remember, self-importance kills. Don't waste your limited energy upholding stands that are untenable. Hold firm to your underpinnings. He laughed at his play on words. Then he continued with earthy directness. The minute a man pays any attention to a woman, she drops her underpinnings. That's simply not true, I argued. A woman can love a man purely, without any physical involvement. But can she love him if he loves other women and not be ruffled by it? He challenged. I thought for a moment. He had a point. From my own experience and from the people I had known, a selfless love like that would really not be feasible in our culture. I shrugged. If you're talking about polygamy, I said, I don't think we women should put up with that. I was so against men playing around that for me, nothing short of total fidelity would do. I remembered how miserable my mother's life had been because of my father's indiscretions. From her, I had learned the attitude that men were heartless masters that would stop at nothing in using a woman, then casting her aside without so much as a backward glance. I'm not talking about polygamy, Don Juan said. I'm talking about freedom from self-importance. No one is unique or privileged by any stretch of the imagination. But if we don't see ourselves as unique or special, how can we distinguish ourselves from other people and things? I asked. Why do you want to distinguish yourself from people or things? He retorted. Individuality is needed to interact in the world of people, but you already know how to do that. What I'm suggesting is an alternative mode of being in which your energetic body interacts with the spirit. And what is the spirit? I asked. Don Juan looked at me steadily for a moment. His cold eyes became fierce like an eagle's. His stare forced me to look away. He chuckled, lifted one of the gourds he had tied to his belt, opened the stopper, and took a sip. I felt obliged to repeat my question. I really don't know, he said. We can return to our origin, even act from it, but we can never know or say what it is. Then what good is it if we can't talk about it? I protested in a tone that bordered on whining. Don Juan grabbed my shoulders and shook them as if I were a rag doll. Stop indulging in self-pity and act like a warrior. He stomped his foot on the ground repeatedly, like a bull ready to charge, giving me a ferocious look that made his nostrils flare. His pantomime was so lifelike that I had to step aside, afraid he would ram me. But instead of charging, he suddenly twirled lightly on his heels and walked out the door. He motioned for me to follow him. Then quite unexpectedly, he veered off into the chaparral. It was all I could do to keep up with him. After an exhausting trek, during which time I employed not doing techniques, such as keeping my gaze above the horizon and my hands in the proper position, and maintained a prolonged silence, I was still breathing heavily by the time we reached a formidable rock formation. Don Juan told me to sit on a large boulder and to slow down my breathing. He said that in the tradition of sorcery, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of not doing techniques, each designed to produce a specific effect that had been intended by sorcerers of his lineage. The hand position was one of them, just as was gazing at the point above the horizon while walking. He reiterated that he personally thought that not doing was one of the best ways a stalker has of disrupting routine or habitual reactions of one's day-to-day life. Do the match technique, he suggested, to quiet down. Now? He nodded and poured a few drops of water from his gourd into a depression in the rock. I pulled out my book of matches, and holding one between my thumb and index finger, I struck it and brought the flame 7 or 8 inches in front of my eyes. As I gazed at it, I inhaled the flame into the area between the eyes until the flame had almost burned down. Then, without extinguishing the flame, I dipped the tip of the match in the water to cool the end and transferred it to the thumb and index fingers of my left hand. I held the match upside down so that the flame was now burning upward a few inches from my eyes. Draw the blue flame into your eyes, Don Juan said. Use intent to pull it inside you. I did a series of 9 matches, burning one end, then turning it upside down as I transferred it to my left hand and gazed at the flame burned at the other end. After 9 matches, he told me to stop. He instructed me to breathe deeply from the abdomen and then began to practice another not doing technique, which involved expanding my awareness behind me, above me, and into the distance all around me. What should I try to look for or feel? I asked. It doesn't matter, he said. Perhaps a tree to the back, or a bird in the branch above you, or a cloud in the sky overhead. The purpose of this not doing technique is to stretch oneself out as if one were casting a giant net. He explained that deliberately elongating one's awareness, which is usually directed forward, has the effect of waking up the energetic body, or double, by breaking through the confining boundaries one had learned to regard as one's physical body. When your mind and breath are able to reach beyond the recognized limits of the physical body, Don Juan explained, then you'll know that things are vacuous and physical and mental continuity is only an expression of the mind or social self. He assured me that our perception of the world is fundamentally tied to how we sense our bodies and how elastic our breathing is. To change our perception of the world, we must begin by changing our awareness of our body. We must know that our bodies are in constant flux. Yet, in order not to lose control during our ethereal wanderings, our awareness has to be firmly fixed. To what is our awareness fixed? I asked. Not to the self or objects of the world, he assured me, for these will keep you imprisoned. Rather, it is anchored to one's breathing. The breath is the line that can pull you outside of your boundaries and make your physical body appear and disappear. He told me to close my eyes and try to anchor my awareness to my breathing. I became apprehensive. Sometimes, when I practiced some of the sorcery passes Clara had taught me, I felt my body melt away. But I never ventured too far on that track for fear of losing myself or becoming totally unknown to myself. Even when I had dreamed I was a crow, I was still aware of being myself, dreaming I was a crow. So I began cautiously. According to Don Juan's instructions, I was to allow my awareness to flow outward in all directions as I elongated my breathing. Then I was to link the stretching of my mind to the rhythmic flow of the breath. Finally, I had to merge my breathing, which was limited, to the limitless breathing of the earth and the sky. He told me to breathe far behind me, high above me, and out to either side, until the vast desert around me moved rhythmically to the expansion and contraction of the breath. After a time of total concentration, I had the sensation of moving like an enormous bellows. My entire panorama was pulsating to the same rhythm. At one point, I was so far away that I could barely hear Don Juan's voice, urging me to open my eyes and describe to him what I had experienced. I was no longer aware of my body, I said. It became so enormous that I seemed to completely vanish. Your body can't vanish, he said, for the simple reason that it was never there in the first place. I rubbed my calves to bring blood back into them. It is the way you place your attention that makes you think you have a physical body, Don Juan said. Place your attention differently, and you will have a different body. Perhaps that of a horse, or a cow, or a falcon. I told him I didn't want the body of a horse or a cow, but I wouldn't mind being a falcon temporarily. You don't need to worry about changing your shape permanently, he assured me. Fate has given you the form of a human being. And no matter where you are, that memory will always pull you back to that particular configuration, at least for the time being. He suggested that since I dreamed I was a crow flying over landscapes, I could try, if I had enough energy, to sustain that configuration for a short while, using the breathing and my attention to bring about the change. Stalking with a double is what enables you to keep the assemblage point fixed in the new dream position, he said. It means fleshing out all the ramifications of being a crow. What it means to fly, how crows feel and move, what it means to interact with other birds, and even to mate as a bird. You did that in your dream earlier. Let's see if you can move your assemblage point to that position now, starting from your waking state. He swept clean an area of ground and spread out my poncho. Then he told me to lie on my stomach and repeat the breathing I had just done. Again, I was to place all my awareness outside of myself, then use my mind to imagine I had formed wings, and my breathing to create the sensation of flying. After a period of intense concentration and controlled breathing, I felt a heaviness on either side of me. It was as if I had gigantic wings, moving in a rhythmic fashion to the pattern of my breath. The area around my face had grown long and pointed, while my legs and arms had become numb and heavy until they disappeared completely. I was looking down. The earth had grown transparent, and I could see fields below me. All the while, the rhythmic expansion of my breath kept the giant wings in motion. At one point, I heard Don Juan whisper that I should slow down my breathing and try to soar for a while. At that suggestion, my breath became slower. I could feel the wind as scenes below me shifted and treetops, scores of shrubs, and distant hills came into view. Then I took another breath, and I was soaring again. After a while, Don Juan told me to stop. He said I should open my eyes and concentrate on remembering my physical body again. As I did, I noticed that the area that was my chin was completely numb. It had been pressed against the hard ground. My arms and legs also were asleep, and it was some time before I could move them. Don Juan briskly rubbed my calves and arms until I felt an acute, painful, tingling sensation. When that sensation subsided, I felt solid again. Was I dreaming? I asked after I had described to Don Juan my experience. You were not asleep, Don Juan assured me. You used your intent and concentrated on your breath to change your shape. Whenever the breath gives life to an idea, that new configuration becomes real. He said the key to any transformation or sorcery shape changing was combining the breath with an idea to give it life. Most of the time, a person has an idea without the power of the breath to actualize it, he said. Or he may have the proper breath energy without the intent to give it form and direction. But when breath and intent become united as movement and direction, energy and form, then a new reality is created and sustained for as long as the two are joined. That is what sorcerers call stalking with the double. It means to use the energy body to perceive a reality with form and substance and energetic validity. It certainly felt as if I had wings and were flying, and I don't recall falling asleep, I said. It had been just as real as the world in front of me now. Of course, you couldn't sustain that intent for very long, Don Juan continued, because to concentrate the breath and flesh out an idea takes extraordinary energy. I loaned you some of mine, so you had no problem in concentrating your breath and giving life to a different reality. A reality you had found on your own earlier while doing dreaming. Now you reactivated that same perceptual place, so you now have another position to go to. That's just as real as that of being a human being. He reiterated that by combining intent and breath, one can, for a time, change one's perception of reality and will oneself to move beyond the confining limits of one's own bodily configuration. This is what sorcerers call stalking with the double, he repeated. And this is what sorcerers do. They expand the possibilities of perceiving beyond the limit that is permitted to us as a social person. In other words, this maximizes their experience as sentient beings. Don Juan went on to say that to change into a bird or an animal was one of the power positions handed down by the ancient sorcerers of his lineage. It is one of the not doing techniques that is still in use today. To be a human being involves more than just being born, living, then dying, he said. It means to expand one's potential by going beyond known boundaries of one's existence and leaping into the unknown. For to have a body is not to merely be so much flesh and bone that has to be fed and kept alive at any cost. To be alive, he stressed, is to be aware, to be a point of view that never knows its own limits. Nevertheless, one must try to comprehend one's nature, to intuit from a finite perspective one's infinite possibilities. Don Juan said that another precept of the stalker was to never know what he was, but to always act as if he did know. To flesh out reality and then discard it. That's what it means to be alive, he said. To intuitively grasp the wonder of the world and to boldly leap into the infinite in spite of our rational limitations. To link our breath with anything we can imagine until we become so fluid and unknown to ourselves that we become the unimaginable. To stalk with a double is to attempt to touch the bottomless springs of our mysterious origins. Don Juan suggested that I sit quietly for a moment and contemplate what he had said. For changing shapes in the tradition of the sorcerers was a deliberate act of not doing of the body, a complex maneuver of stalking. Only by departing from inner silence can one reach the deep level of awareness that will allow us to grasp and move intuitively, he said. Only by rest and renunciation can one circumvent the relentless control of reason. He uncorked his gourd and gave me a drink. Right away, I felt better and noticed that the nervous tremor that had taken hold of my midsection had all but disappeared. It is not our body that makes us the same day after day, he disclosed after a long silence. One's body is constantly changing, degenerating, and soon it will die. Regard your body as yourself, and you too will degenerate and die. What then should I regard as myself? I asked. Don Juan smiled. His eyes became two slits as he peered at me. See yourself as a spirit that roams the realm of the unchanging, he replied. Consider yourself one with the mysterious darkness that is never increased or diminished. Regard yourself as this, and your potential will be limitless. Don Juan explained that whereas our bodies and our actions are in constant flux, only the realm of the dark mysterious remains constant, because nothing can be added to it or taken from it. Therefore, in order to have genuine continuity, which is in essence no continuity at all, we must link ourselves to the strata beyond the world of appearance. Our bodies must become so abstract that we become aware of not being. We are what we are not, Don Juan said cryptically. And whatever we think we are is temporary, illusory, and only the smallest fragment of our true nature. Then if we could never know ourselves, I said, it seemed to me too lonely, too solitary, a path to be beneficial. I had always thought that even if people were indifferent to one another, they were still there to fall back on. To be without a self would be to be without others. And that seemed to me the coldest, most desolate mode of existence. There is no way you can ever be with yourself or others, Don Juan reiterated, except as controlled folly. We are the empty manifestations of an unknowable force sorcerers call the eagle. He said the light that reaches our eyes are the eagle's emanations. He stressed that it is a mistake for us to regard our acts as our own, or to think of ourselves in charge or in command. For to do so only perpetuates the false dichotomy of a self that is the motivating force of an action, and another self that is the doer or executor behind that action. It is that mind-body misconception that is at the root of our confusion. It leads to a false view of the world. Give your breath and energy to perpetuate the social person, and your real nature remains forever obscured, Don Juan warned. For the self or the social, cultural image that one enhances with one's life force is a mistake. It is only a way of thinking and talking, and not what we are at all. He admitted that our true nature is one with the underlying force that sorcerers call the eagle. Seers can see its energy flowing through us and making up our very being. And we must humbly acknowledge that life force, or we remain blind to everything around us. I wanted Don Juan to tell me more about this mysterious power that acts through us. He shrugged and replied that there was nothing more to say about it, that we simply were different aspects of the eagle's emanations, just as was everything else in existence. I pressed him to elaborate on his attributes. Sorcerers have been unable to unravel its mystery, even though, through antiquity, seers have put all their efforts into attempting to understand it. And because of this inability, they called it the Great Unfathomable. The old sorcerers called it the eagle because it stands with its beak open, ready to devour awareness at the moment of death. Its emanations are commands because we must follow them, just as planets must follow their orbits in the sky. Those who humbly acquiesce to the eagle's commands remain healthy and strong. Those who fight against them wear themselves out and find an early death. He stressed that only by acquiescing to the force that moves us can we find well-being and purpose, happiness. Fighting against it brings disease and unhappiness. In order to create anything, he explained, we must draw from the emanations of the eagle, from its dark side, and bring it in to being. That is, into the field of awareness of man. This is how sorcerers make things happen. This is the true essence of magic. Since everything has a dark side and a light side, the dual elements of movement and rest, of activity and inaction, things can be flipped around. And that is how sorcerers cross the boundaries of the visible world into the realm of the invisible. Are you talking about the mythical realm of the Yaqui Indians? I asked. I'm not just talking about the realm of the Yaqui Indians, he stressed. I am talking about all existence. If your awareness is linked to the origin of all things, you can accomplish seemingly impossible feats. How does one do that? Follow the natural rhythm of things and move with the energy around you, he said. If you want to act, you must be tranquil. By the same token, if you want to rest, you must fill yourself with activity. He said that when both elements, being and not being, are in balance, so that inside we are unchanging and imperturbable, but outside we are fluid and changeable, then we reflect the power behind all things. He added that in order to reflect the realm of the unchanging, we have to suspend our everyday view of the world. He stressed that suspending our human judgments is the first step into the realm of the unknowable. And for this to take place, quieting the internal dialogue is a fundamental prerequisite. Therefore, it is of utmost importance to achieve inner silence through the practice of the recapitulation, the sorcery passes, and all the sorcery not doing techniques you have been taught. He said, only in this way can you lose yourself and be one with the vastness.